He stood in the doorway of a cabin built for two, looking at a woman who wasn't meant to be there. The agency made a mistake, or maybe fate just had a cruel sense of humor. He told her flat out she wasn't the woman he sent for. Her response? A quiet, desperate bargain. This is a story about a harsh winter, a mistaken bride, and a stubborn mountain man who didn't know what he actually needed. Settle in. Winter came early to the jagged ridges of the Bighorn Mountains. Frost had already hardened the mud rut leading up to the cabin into a jagged spine of ice. Nora stood at the edge of the clearing, a battered carpetbag gripped in her red, bare hands. Her wool coat was meant for the damp chill of Chicago streets, not the thin, slicing air of an elevation of 8,000 feet. The buckboard wagon that brought her was already gone. The driver hadn't even waited to see if anyone was home. He dropped her trunk, collected the last $2 to her name, and whipped his mules back down the treacherous pass. Nora stared at the cabin. It was a rough-hewn structure, built of heavy pine logs, chinked with mud and horsehair. A stone chimney bled grey smoke into the heavier grey sky. She didn't knock. She didn't have the strength left. She just stood there shivering, waiting for the door to open. 10 minutes passed. The door remained shut. Behind her, a twig snapped with the sharpness of a pistol shot. Nora spun around her boots, slipping on the frozen earth. A man emerged from the tree line. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a terrifying silence for a man his size. A heavy canvas coat hung on his frame, stained dark with grease and age. A rifle rested easily over his right shoulder, and in his left hand he held the hind legs of a freshly killed jackrabbit. He stopped when he saw her. He didn't drop the rabbit. He didn't lower the rifle. He just stared. Nora swallowed hard. The air in her lungs felt like ground glass. "Carmine Steeves?" she asked. Her voice cracked a thin, pathetic sound in the vastness of the mountain silence. He didn't answer right away. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, moved over her. They took in her inadequate coat, her shivering frame, her pale city skin, and the battered trunk resting in the mud. He looked at her the way a man looks at a broken tool he doesn't have the time to fix. "You're not Corliss," he said. His voice was gravel and wood smoke. Low. Flat. "No," Nora said. She didn't try to smile. There was no point in charm out here. "I'm Nora. Nora Higgins." Carmine stepped past her, dropping the rabbit onto a wide stump near the door. He leaned his rifle against the cabin wall. "I sent a draft to the agency in St. Louis for Corliss Phillips, a farm girl. Broad shoulders. Said she knew how to butcher a hog and run a trap line." He turned back to her, wiping a smear of blood from his hand onto his canvas trousers. "You look like you'd blow away in a stiff breeze." "Corliss married a bank teller 2 weeks before the train ticket arrived," Nora said. Her teeth were chattering now. She locked her jaw to stop it. "The agency didn't want to lose the commission. They asked if anyone else wanted to go. I needed out of the city, so I took the ticket." Carmine let out a short, harsh breath through his nose. He looked past her down the empty trail. "Driver's gone. He didn't want to beat the weather. Neither do I." Carmine reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a tobacco pouch, and then shoved it back in, irritated. "I don't have a horse for you to ride down, and I'm not walking you back to town. It's a 3-day hike, and the snow is going to hit by midnight, but I'm not keeping you." He looked directly at her. There was no malice in his eyes, just cold, hard arithmetic. A woman who couldn't pull her weight out here was a death sentence for them both. "You're not the woman I chose," he said. Nora gripped the handle of her carpetbag until her knuckles turned white. She had nowhere to go. She had no money. She had outrun debts that would see her thrown in a workhouse, or worse, back into the alleys of the ward she grew up in. Panic clawed at her throat, but she shoved it down. She forced herself to look him in the eye. "Let me stay until you find her," she whispered. Carmine frowned. "I told you she married a banker. Until you find another one, then," Nora corrected her voice, gaining a fraction of strength. "Until spring thaw, you need the cabin kept. You need clothes mended. I can cook, I can clean, I can sew. You give me a roof and fire until the pass is open in April, and I'll leave on the first wagon down. You won't even have to pay me." Carmine stared at her. The wind picked up howling through the pines, biting at Nora's cheeks. She stood perfectly still, letting him weigh her worth. "You can't survive a winter up here," he said finally. "I survived 22 winters in a city that wanted me dead," Nora replied flatly. "I can survive one in a cabin." Carmine held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned around, picked up the dead rabbit by the ears, and opened the cabin door. "Bring your bag in," he said over his shoulder. "I'll fetch the trunk." The inside of the cabin was exactly as Nora expected, yet infinitely more claustrophobic. It was a single room 15 by 15 feet. A cast-iron stove dominated the center, radiating a ferocious heat that smelled of scorched iron and dry pine. A small table with 2 chairs sat near the single greasepaper window. In the corner, a bed frame built into the wall held a mattress, ticking stuffed with rustling pine needles, covered by a heavy buffalo robe. There was only one bed. Nora set her carpetbag down by the door. Carmine carried her trunk in a moment later, dropping it against the far wall with a heavy thud that rattled the floorboards. "I sleep in the loft," he said, catching her looking at the bed. He pointed to a ladder made of stripped saplings, nailed to the wall leading to a dark crawl space beneath the pitched roof. "Bed's yours." "Thank you," Nora said. "Don't thank me. You'll be maintaining the fire at night. Stove goes out, we freeze. Bed's closer to the stove." He walked over to a basin, poured water from a tin pitcher, and began washing his hands with coarse yellow soap. The first 48 hours were a brutal education in survival. The altitude sickness hit Nora on the second morning. Her head pounded with a relentless, sickening rhythm, and her stomach rebelled against the heavy smell of frying salt pork. She spent most of the day sitting on the edge of the bed, her head between her knees, trying to pull oxygen from the thin mountain air. Carmine ignored her. He didn't offer sympathy, nor did he complain. He simply stepped over her to get to the wood box, cooked his own meals, and left before the sun cleared the ridges to check his traps. Nora realized very quickly that his silence wasn't a punishment. It was just his nature. He was a man who lived alone because he preferred the company of trees over people. She was an intrusion, a noisy, sickly complication in his heavily routine life. On the third day, the nausea faded. Nora forced herself up. If she was going to prove she wasn't a liability, she had to work. She started with the cabin. It was organized but filthy. Soot covered everything. The floor was caked with dried mud. She boiled water on the stove, a task that took much longer than she expected at this altitude, and found a rag. By the time Carmine returned at dusk, the smell of burnt iron had been replaced by the sharp scent of lye soap. The floor was swept, the table was scrubbed raw, and his spare shirts were soaking in a bucket. He walked in, stopped, and looked around. He kicked his boots off near the door, noting they no longer tracked mud onto a dirty floor, but a clean one. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "It's my end of the bargain," Nora replied. She was standing by the stove, stirring a pot of beans she had found in the larder. "Dinner will be ready in 10 minutes. Carmine sat at the table. He watched her work. Nora could feel the weight of his stare. She grabbed a rag to pull the cast-iron pot off the heat, but the rag was damp from cleaning. The heat instantly transferred through the wet cloth, searing her palm. She gasped, dropping the pot. It slammed onto the stovetop. A third of the beans sloshed out, hissing and burning instantly on the hot iron. Nora cursed, grabbing her burnt hand, tears of sheer frustration springing to her eyes. She waited for the reprimand. She waited for him to tell her she was useless, just like her father used to say, just like the factory foreman used to yell. Carmine stood up. He walked over, grabbed a dry towel, and smoothly moved the pot to the cool side of the stove. He didn't look at her. He went to a small wooden box on a shelf, pulled out a tin of pale yellow salve, and set it on the table. "Pine pitch and beeswax," he said, sitting back down. "Put it on the burn." Nora stood there, cradling her hand. "I ruined half the beans." "I have 50 pounds of beans in the root cellar," Carmine said. He pulled his knife from his belt and began cleaning his fingernails. Dry rag for hot metal. Wet rag turns to steam. Steam burns faster than fire. Learn it. That was it. No yelling. No degradation. Just a fact. Nora sat at the table, opened the tin, and rubbed the thick, herbal-smelling salve onto her blistered skin. The pain began to dull almost instantly. She served the remaining beans, scraping the burnt ones off the stove into the slop bucket. They ate in silence. The beans were undercooked and lacked salt. Carmine ate 2 bowls anyway, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and climbed the ladder to the loft. Nora washed the dishes in the dark. The cabin was quiet, save for the crackle of the wood in the stove. She looked down at her bandaged hand, then up at the dark square of the loft hatch. He was a hard man. But for the first time in her life, she felt safe around a hard man. The snow started on a Tuesday and didn't stop for 4 days. It was a suffocating whiteout. The wind screamed down the chimney, blowing smoke back into the room. The cold was a physical presence, pressing against the log walls, trying to find a way in. They were trapped in a 15 by 15 box, forced into a proximity that made every breath sound loud. Cabin fever set in quickly. Carmine spent hours sitting by the window, repairing leather harnesses and sharpening knives, his jaw tight. He was a man used to walking 10 miles a day. Being cooped up made him restless, irritable. He paced like a caged wolf. Nora kept her head down. She mended every piece of clothing he owned. She darned socks until her fingers cramped. She tried to stay out of his way, but in a room this small, they were constantly bumping elbows, brushing shoulders. Every accidental touch was met with a rigid pull-away from Carmine. On the 3rd night of the storm, the temperature plummeted to a level Nora hadn't thought possible. Even with the stove burning, red-hot ice began to form on the inside of the window pane. Carmine sat by the fire, working oil into his boots. Nora sat on the bed wrapped in a blanket, her teeth chattering despite the heat from the stove. "Why'd he leave you?" Carmine asked suddenly. Nora jumped. It was the first non-essential question he had asked her since she arrived. Whoever you were running from in Chicago." He didn't look up from his boots. Women don't take a blind ticket to the mountains just because they want fresh air. "You ran." Nora tightened the blanket around her shoulders. She debated lying. It would be easier. But the isolation of the storm made lies feel pointless. "I wasn't running from a man," she said quietly. "I was running from a debt. My father died last spring. He owed a lot of money to men who don't forgive debts. They told me I could work it off in one of their establishments, or they would break my legs and throw me in the river. The train ticket was $4. The agency paid for the rest." Carmine stopped rubbing the oil into the leather. He stared into the open door of the stove, watching the flames lick around a log of split pine. "So you lied to the agency," he said. "Yes." You knew you couldn't do the work out here." "I knew I'd die if I stayed in Chicago," Nora corrected, her voice hardening. "I figured freezing to death on a mountain was a cleaner way to go." Carmine finally looked at her. The firelight danced in his pale eyes, softening the harsh lines of his face. For a moment, Nora thought he might actually say something comforting. Instead, he set his boots down, stood up, and grabbed his heavy buffalo hide coat from a peg on the wall. "Where are you going?" she asked, alarmed. "It's a blizzard out there." "Woodbox is empty," he said. "If I don't get more, we freeze tonight." He opened the door. The wind roared into the cabin, a wall of white snow instantly blowing across the floorboards. Carmine disappeared into the howling dark, forcing the door shut behind him. Nora sat frozen. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Panic began to rise in her chest. What if he got turned around? What if he fell? If he died out there, she would die in here. She didn't know how to chop wood. She didn't know how to hunt. She stood up, dropping the blanket, and went to the door. She grabbed the iron latch. It was freezing cold. She pulled it open. The wind hit her like a physical blow, knocking her back a step. She shielded her eyes from the blinding snow staring into the dark. "Carmine!" she screamed. The wind snatched the name from her mouth and tore it apart. A heavy shape bumped against her legs. Carmine pushed past her, into the cabin, dropping an enormous armful of split wood onto the floor. He kicked the door shut, leaning against it, breathing heavily. His beard was caked in ice. Snow covered his coat. "What were you doing opening the door?" He barked, his voice rough. "You were gone too long," Nora said, her voice shaking from the cold and the residual adrenaline. "I thought you got lost. It's a woodpile 10 feet from the door, Nora." "I wasn't lost." He walked over to the stove and began shoving wood into the firebox. Nora crossed her arms, rubbing her shoulders. I didn't know." Carmine shut the stove door with a metallic clang. He turned and looked at her. She was shivering violently now, the brief exposure to the storm having robbed her of whatever warmth she had hoarded. He didn't say a word. He walked over to the bed, grabbed the heavy buffalo robe that served as her primary blanket, and walked over to her. He threw it over her shoulders. The weight of it almost buckled her knees, but the sheer insulating warmth of the thick fur was immediate. "Sit by the stove," he said, his voice lower, the anger gone. "You're no good to me, Frozen." Nora pulled the robe tight around her. She looked up at him. He was brushing the snow out of his beard, refusing to meet her eyes. It was a small thing, a purely practical gesture. But as she sat down, in the chair near the radiating heat of the iron, she felt a strange, unfamiliar ache in her chest. They weren't friends. They certainly weren't lovers. But they were surviving. And for the first time, Nora felt like they were surviving together. Silence fell over the mountain on the 5th morning. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a world buried under 3 feet of fresh powder. The wind had finally died, leaving behind a sky so violently blue it hurt the eyes. Carmine shoved the cabin door open, using his shoulder to break the snowdrift that had piled against the wood. Sunlight flooded the dark room, harsh and unforgiving. Nora squinted from the table where she was meticulously restitching the seam of Carmine's spare canvas trousers. "Put your boots on," Carmine said. He didn't turn around. He was already pulling a pair of wide, teardrop-shaped frames wrapped in rawhide from the rafters. Snowshoes. "You're coming with me." Nora paused, the needle halfway through the heavy fabric. "Where?" "Trap line." He tossed a smaller pair of snowshoes onto the floor near her feet. "You wanted to earn your keep until spring. You can't do that sitting by the stove. Meat's getting low. We need rabbits, maybe a marten if we're lucky. Move." She didn't argue. She layered 2 pairs of wool socks, shoved her feet into her boots, and wrapped a woolen scarf tightly around her face. Stepping out of the cabin was like stepping into a frozen lung. The air was so cold it burned her nostrils and tasted of metal. Carmine showed her how to strap the snowshoes on. He didn't do it for her. He demonstrated on his own boot, then watched as her numb fingers fumbled with the stiff leather ties on hers. When she finally got them secure, she stood up. She took one step, crossed the tails of the shoes, and pitched forward, face first, into a snowdrift. Snow packed down her collar, shocking her skin. She heard a sharp exhale above her. Not a laugh, just a sound of tired resignation. "Keep your feet wide," Carmine said, his voice muffled by his own scarf. "Walk from the hip, not the knee, like a duck." Nora pushed herself up, spitting snow from her lips. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, but she swallowed it down. She widened her stance. She lifted her right leg, dragged it forward in a wide arc, and set it down. Then the left. It was awkward, exhausting work. By the time they reached the edge of the tree line, a mere 100 yards from the cabin, she was sweating beneath her heavy coat, her thighs screaming in protest. Carmine set a punishing pace. He glided over the snow with the practiced ease of a man who had spent half his life in the backcountry. He didn't look back to check on her. He simply expected her to keep up, or die trying. Nora chose to keep up. She focused on the back of his boots, matching his rhythm, forcing her burning lungs to expand and contract. The first trap held a frozen snowshoe hare. It was stiff as a board, its eyes clouded over. Carmine knelt, unhitched the wire snare, and tossed the frozen carcass to Nora. She caught it awkwardly against her chest. It felt like a block of wood covered in fur. "Put it in the sack," he ordered, pointing to the canvas bag slung over her shoulder. She did. They moved on. For 3 hours they trekked through the silent, brutal landscape. The mountains were a jagged fortress of white and slate-grey, beautiful in a way that made Nora feel entirely insignificant. In the city, the buildings blocked out the sky, making human problems seem large. Out here, human problems didn't matter. The mountain didn't care about her debts. It didn't care about Carmine's solitude. It only cared about cold and gravity. At the fourth trap, Carmine stopped abruptly. He held up a hand. Nora froze her breath, pluming in the air. Ahead of them, the snow was torn up, stained with broad, violent splashes of red. The snare wire was snapped, the wooden anchor post splintered. Carmine unslung his rifle in one fluid motion, thumbing the hammer back. The click was deafening in the silence. He crouched his eyes, tracking a set of massive, deep indentations leading away from the blood into a thick stand of black spruce. "Cougar," he said softly. "Found the rabbit before we did." Nora's stomach plummeted. "Is it still here?" "No. Tracks are frozen at the edges. Happened last night." He stood up, letting the hammer back down, but he didn't sling the rifle. He looked at Nora. She was pale, her knuckles white, where she gripped the canvas sack of dead rabbits. "Scared?" he asked. "Yes," she said honestly. There was no point in bravado. Carmine nodded slowly. "Good. Fear keeps you breathing. Panic kills you. Know the difference." He turned back to the trail. "Let's go home." The walk back was agonizing. The adrenaline had faded, leaving Nora's muscles feeling like lead. Every step was a negotiation with her own limits. She fell twice more. The second time, she couldn't immediately find the strength to push herself up. She lay in the snow, her cheek pressed against the freezing powder, tears of pure exhaustion prickling the corners of her eyes. A shadow fell over her. Carmine stood above her. He didn't offer his hand. He simply looked down at her, his pale blue eyes unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "You can stay there," he said, his voice devoid of pity. "It's a quiet way to go. You just go to sleep, or you can get up and eat hot rabbit stew in an hour. Your choice." Nora stared at his boots. Anger, hot and bright, sparked in her chest. It chased away the cold. She hated him in that moment. She hated his detachment, his relentless competence, his refusal to offer her an ounce of softness. She dug her mittened hands into the snow and pushed herself up to her knees, then to her feet. She glared at him, her chest heaving. "I prefer stew," she spat. The corner of Carmine's mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, not quite, but it was a fracture in the ice. He turned around and resumed walking. Nora followed, fueled by spite, matching him step for step, all the way back to the cabin. That night, as she ate the hot, rich meat of the rabbit they had butchered together, she realized something profound. He hadn't left her behind. He hadn't yelled. He had just given her the space to decide if she was strong enough to survive. And she was. Winter didn't care about truces. It only knew how to take. 2 weeks after their first trip on the snowshoes, the routine shattered. Carmine had gone out to check the far northern line, a steep ridge composed of treacherous shale hidden beneath the snow. He was supposed to be back by noon. By 3 o'clock, the sun dipped behind the western peaks, throwing long, bruised shadows across the valley. Nora paced the length of the cabin, continually throwing glances at the frost-rimed window. The fire was roaring, the stew was bubbling, but the emptiness of the room felt heavier than usual. At 4 o'clock, she heard the heavy dragging sound of footsteps on the porch. She threw the door open. Carmine leaned heavily against the doorframe, his face the color of wet ash. His breathing was ragged wet and shallow. He wasn't carrying his rifle. He wasn't carrying the game sack. He was barely holding himself upright. "Carmine!" Nora caught him just as his knees buckled. He was a massive man, 200 pounds of dense muscle and heavy bone, and his dead weight drove her to the floorboards. He let out a low, guttural groan, a sound of pure agony. Close. The door. He ground out, his eyes screwed shut. Nora scrambled up, slammed the door against the creeping cold, and dropped to her knees beside him. She grabbed his shoulders, trying to pull him toward the bed. "What happened? Where are you hurt?" "Fell." He managed to leverage himself up onto one arm, dragging his right leg behind him. "Deadfall trap." Log gave way, slid down the scree. Nora saw it then. The thick canvas of his right trouser leg was torn open from the knee to the ankle. The fabric was soaked, the blood already beginning to freeze into a stiff, dark crust. Panic seized her throat, tight and absolute. She didn't know anything about medicine. She knew how to avoid getting hit. She knew how to mend a hem. But she didn't know how to put a broken man back together. "Come on," she urged, grabbing his arm and throwing it over her shoulder. "Get to the bed." Now. Together they managed the 10 feet to the mattress. Carmine collapsed onto the pine needle, ticking with a heavy thud, his teeth gritted so hard a muscle jumped in his jaw. Nora grabbed her sewing shears from the table. "I have to cut the pants," she said, her hands shaking. Carmine didn't argue. He was staring at the ceiling, his breathing hitched and uneven. Nora cut through the stiff, blood-soaked canvas and peeled it back. She sucked in a breath. The gash was horrific. It ran jagged along the side of his calf, deep enough to expose the white sheen of the fascia beneath the muscle. It was clogged with dirt pine needles and shards of broken shale. "I need water." Carmine rasped his voice, sounding thin, stripped of its usual timbre. "Boil it. Need to clean the rock out." Nora sprang into action. The hesitation burned away, replaced by a cold, desperate focus. She swung the heavy iron kettle onto the hottest part of the stove. She found a clean flour sack, tore it into strips, and gathered the tin of pine pitch salve and a bottle of cheap, harsh whiskey Carmine kept under the floorboards. By the time the water boiled, Carmine was shivering violently, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the draft in the room. The shock was wearing off. The pain was setting in fully. "Hold my leg," he ordered, as she approached, with the basin of steaming water and the whiskey. "Don't let me kick." Nora braced her forearms against his heavy thigh, pinning him down. Carmine uncorked the bottle with his teeth, spit the cork onto the floor, and poured the raw alcohol directly into the open wound. He roared. It wasn't a shout. It was the sound of an animal caught in a trap. His body violently arched off the bed, his muscles corded like steel cables beneath her arms. Nora clamped her eyes shut, fighting the urge to let go, pressing her entire body weight against his leg to keep it steady. He slumped back, gasping, his skin slick with a cold sweat. "Clean it," he whispered, his eyes closing. "Get the dirt out." It took 20 minutes. Nora used the boiled water and the clean rags to painstakingly wash the grit and rock from his torn flesh. Her hands were covered in his blood. Every time she dug a piece of shale out, Carmine flinched, but he didn't make another sound. He just lay there, enduring it. She packed the wound with the thick yellow pine salve and wrapped it tightly with the torn flour sacks. When she was done, she sat back on her heels, her chest heaving, as if she had just run 10 miles. Carmine was unconscious. Or asleep. Nora couldn't tell the difference. The real terror didn't begin until midnight. The fever hit him like a freight train. He thrashed under the heavy buffalo robes, kicking them off as his body burned from the inside out. The infection had set in faster than she thought possible, a dark, angry red creeping up his leg from the edge of the bandages. Nora didn't sleep. She spent the entire night cycling between the stove and the bed. She placed cold, wet rags on his forehead, which he continuously tried to swat away in his delirium. He muttered. Words she couldn't understand. Names. "Sarah," he mumbled around 3 a.m, his head tossing side to side on the pillow. "Told you not to cross. The ice is thin." Nora froze, a cold rag dripping over the wash basin. Sarah. Not Corliss, the bride he had ordered. Sarah. He reached out blindly, his large, calloused hand gripping Nora's wrist with bruising force. His pale eyes snapped open, but they were glassy, unseeing. They were looking at ghosts. "Don't let go," he begged, his voice cracking, shedding every ounce of the hard, cynical mountain man she knew. He sounded terrified. "Please, I can't pull you up." Nora looked down at the man who had terrified her just a month ago. The man who made her walk until she collapsed. He was broken, burning up, drowning in a memory she couldn't see. She didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she sat on the edge of the bed. She placed her free hand over his massive, trembling fingers. "I'm here," she said softly, her voice steady in the quiet cabin. "I won't let go. You're safe." Carmine let out a long, shuddering breath. His grip loosened slightly, though he didn't let go of her wrist. His eyes fluttered shut, the lines of panic on his face easing just a fraction. Nora sat there for the rest of the night, listening to the wind howl outside, feeling the racing pulse of his heart beneath her fingertips. He had saved her from the cold. Now it was her turn to pull him back from the edge. They were tied together now, bound by blood fever and the brutal arithmetic of survival. And for the first time, Nora realized she didn't want the spring thaw to come. Fever broke on the 4th day. It didn't announce its departure with fanfare, just a sudden, profound shift in the cabin's air. The sour smell of sickness gave way to the sharp tang of wood smoke and old coffee. Carmine opened his eyes. The ceiling beams were in focus. The violent burning haze had lifted, leaving him hollowed out and impossibly heavy. He tried to shift his right leg. A sharp, pulling ache radiated from his calf, but the agonizing throb of infection was gone. He turned his head. Nora was asleep on the floor. She had dragged a thin woolen blanket and a spare canvas tarp near the stove. She was curled into a tight ball, her knees pulled up to her chest. Her face was smudged with soot, and dark, heavy circles bruised the skin beneath her eyes. Her hands, resting near her chin, were wrapped in dirty rags. Carmine stared at her. Memory filtered back in fractured pieces. The deadfall, the blinding pain of the hike back, the whiskey, the fire in his blood. He remembered a grip on his wrist, a voice cutting through the delirium, anchoring him to the room when the ghosts tried to drag him under. He pushed himself up on his elbows. The effort left him breathless. The bed frame creaked. Nora snapped awake. She didn't stretch or yawn. She simply went from unconscious to alert in a single second, a reflex born of street survival. She sat up, tossing the blanket aside, and looked at him. "You're awake," she said. Her voice was raspy, stripped of any inflection. "Water," Carmine rasped. Nora stood, her joints popping in the quiet room. She poured water from the pitcher into a tin cup, walked to the bed, and handed it to him. He took it, his hand trembling slightly. He drank it down in 3 long swallows. It tasted like tin and stale air, and it was the best thing he had ever consumed. He handed the cup back. "How long?" "4 days," she said. She didn't look at him for long. She turned to the stove, grabbing a heavy iron poker to stir the embers. "The infection peaked night before last. I thought I was going to have to cut the leg off. I was trying to figure out how to do it with a hunting knife and a meat saw." Carmine looked at his bandaged leg, then at her stiff back. "Did you check the traps?" Nora stopped prodding the fire. She turned slowly. Her expression was a mix of exhaustion and sheer, unadulterated disbelief. "Did I check the traps you were dying on that mattress, Carmine?" "No, I didn't check the traps. I kept the fire going so you wouldn't freeze to death in your sleep." He looked away, staring at the soot-stained wall. He wasn't used to depending on anyone. The realization that he had been entirely at her mercy, a helpless burden, grated against his pride like coarse sandpaper. "Woodbox is getting low," he muttered. Nora stared at him. She let out a short, harsh laugh. She tossed the iron poker onto the hearth with a loud clatter. "Right. The woodbox." She marched to the corner, grabbed his heavy splitting axe, and walked to the door. She yanked it open, stepping out into the freezing morning air, and slammed it shut behind her. Carmine lay back down, staring at the ceiling. 10 minutes later, he heard the dull, uneven thwack of the axe hitting wood. He dragged himself out of bed. It took 5 minutes just to get upright, leaning heavily on the table, gritting his teeth against the pull of his torn muscles. He hobbled to the greasepaper window and scraped a layer of frost away with his thumbnail. Outside, Nora had a round of pine set on the chopping block. The axe was too heavy for her. She swung it in an awkward, looping arc. The blade caught the edge of the wood, glancing off and burying itself in the packed snow. She lost her balance, stumbling forward to her knees. Carmine watched her swear, her breath pluming in the cold air. She yanked the axe out of the snow. She set the wood back up. She swung again. This time the axe bit into the center of the round, but it stuck fast. She yanked on the handle, planting her boot against the wood, fighting the dense grain. She was stubborn. Stubborn as a cornered badger. She worked for an hour. By the time she hauled a canvas carrier full of splintered, uneven logs into the cabin, she was drenched in sweat. She dropped the wood by the stove, breathing heavily. She saw Carmine leaning against the table, watching her. "Wide stance," Carmine said quietly. "Let the weight of the axe head do the work. Don't force it down. Guide it." Nora wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a streak of dirt. "Are you critiquing my form? I'm telling you how to save your back," he replied. "You keep swinging like that, you'll tear a shoulder. Then we both freeze." She glared at him, but the anger lacked heat. She walked over to the basin, poured water, and began washing her hands. When she pulled the rags off, Carmine saw the raw, open blisters crossing her palms. "There's salve on the shelf," he said. "I know where the salve is," Nora snapped. "I'm the one who dug it out of your leg." She rubbed the ointment into her hands, wincing. Silence settled over the cabin, heavy but no longer hostile. Carmine looked at the jaggedly chopped wood, then at the young woman from the city who had just kept him alive. "You did good, Nora," he said. The words felt foreign in his mouth, clumsy and rough. Nora paused, her hands slick with beeswax. She looked at him, searching his face for mockery. Finding none, she simply nodded, turned her back, and began to build up the fire. The balance of power had shifted. He was no longer the sole provider, the untethered mountain man. He was broken, and she was holding the pieces together. February arrived with teeth. The temperature dropped so low the trees outside snapped and popped in the dead of night, their sap freezing solid. Carmine's leg was healing, but the progress was agonizingly slow. The deep muscle tear required time he didn't want to give it. He spent his days sitting in the chair by the window, repairing gear, oiling traps, and watching the snow. He was a caged animal, his temper constantly simmering just below the surface. Nora ignored his foul moods. She had settled into a brutal, necessary rhythm. She checked the close traps returning with frostbitten cheeks and the occasional scrawny hair. She chopped the wood, her swing improving her hands, hardening into calloused leather. She kept the cabin clean, the food hot and the fire burning. One evening after a dinner of salted pork and hardtack, it was time to change his bandages. Carmine sat on the edge of the bed. Nora knelt on the floor in front of him, a basin of warm water and clean strips of boiled cotton at her side. She unwrapped the dirty dressing with practiced efficiency. The wound was ugly, a jagged, puckered line of angry red and purple flesh spanning his calf. But it was closed. No heat radiated from the skin, no foul smell tainted the air. Nora dipped a rag in the water and gently washed the skin around the healing tear. Her touch was light, clinical. "It's scarring over," she said, her voice quiet in the dim light of the oil lamp. "You won't lose the leg. Just have a limp to match my temper," Carmine muttered, looking down at her. She sat back on her heels, reaching for the fresh cotton. "Who was Sarah?" The question dropped into the quiet room, like a stone into a deep well. Carmine froze. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his thick beard. He looked away, staring at the iron stove glowing red in the center of the room. Nora didn't press. She began wrapping the clean cotton tightly around his calf, securing the end with a small pin. "My wife," Carmine said. Nora's hands stilled for a fraction of a second, then resumed their work. "You said her name when the fever was high." Carmine leaned back, resting his hands on the mattress behind him. He didn't want to talk about this. He hadn't spoken her name aloud in 6 years. But looking at Nora, at the soot on her cheek, the calluses on her hands, the quiet strength that had dragged him out of an early grave, he felt a strange, terrifying urge to lay the truth bare. "We came out here together," Carmine said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Built this cabin. She wasn't built for it. Too soft. Too kind. She loved the mountains in the summer, but the winter terrified her." Nora finished the bandage. She didn't move away. She stayed kneeling on the floor, listening. It was a late thaw. He continued staring at the floorboards. "April. We needed fresh meat. I took her with me down to the lower lake to ice fish. I told her to stay near the shoreline. The ice gets thin near the center where the current moves. I went to check a trap line in the timber. He stopped. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. He swallowed hard. I heard the crack from a mile away, Carmine whispered. By the time I got back, she was in the water. She was holding on to the edge of the ice. I crawled out on my belly, reached for her. He looked down at his own massive hands, flexing them slowly. Her hands were numb. The cold takes your grip before you even realize it's gone. I grabbed her wrists. She looked right at me, and she slipped under. Current pulled her under the sheet ice. I couldn't break it. I beat the ice until my knuckles shattered, but I couldn't reach her. Nora felt a tight, sharp ache in her throat. She looked up at him. The hard, untouchable mountain man was gone. In his place was a man entirely hollowed out by a 6-year-old failure. That's why you ordered a farm girl, Nora said softly. Someone who knew the dangers. Someone you wouldn't have to protect. Someone I wouldn't have to love, Carmine corrected, meeting her eyes. The raw honesty in his pale gaze made Nora's breath catch. You don't survive out here if you care about something more than your own life. It makes you careless. It makes you weak. He looked at Nora, really looked at her. He took in the ruined hands, the exhausted posture, the sheer, undeniable grit of her. When you opened that door in the blizzard to look for me, Carmine said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. That was careless, Nora. I thought you were dead, she defended quietly. If I was opening that door, would have killed you too, he said. He reached out his large hand, wrapping gently around her wrist the exact spot he had bruised during his fever dream. You stopped running Chicago. You're fighting for a place now. Nora looked down at his hand on her wrist. The warmth of his skin seeped through her sleeve. She didn't pull away. Where are you sleeping tonight? Carmine asked abruptly. Nora blinked, thrown off by the sudden shift in conversation. On the floor. By the stove. No, you're not. Carmine let go of her wrist and shifted backward, sliding closer to the wall, making room on the narrow mattress. Floor drafts will give you pneumonia. Legs closed. I'm not bleeding on the ticking anymore. Nora stared at the empty space on the bed. The mattress was barely wide enough for 1.5 people. Sleeping there meant sleeping pressed against him. It wasn't a romantic invitation. It was a survival tactic. But the air between them suddenly felt charged, heavy with an entirely different kind of tension. I'm fine on the floor, she said, her voice wavering slightly. Get in the bed, Nora, Carmine said. It wasn't a request. It was the gruff, commanding tone he used when he was teaching her to survive. But there was a softness beneath it, a quiet concession. I owe you my life. The least I can do is share the blankets. Nora stood up. She blew out the oil lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness, illuminated only by the faint orange glow of the stove. She kept her clothes on, climbed onto the edge of the mattress, and pulled the heavy buffalo robe over her shoulders. She lay rigidly on her side, her back to him, staring into the dark. She could feel the heat radiating off his massive frame just inches away. A moment later, Carmine shifted. His back pressed lightly against hers, a solid, immovable wall of heat. He didn't wrap his arms around her. He didn't cross the boundary. But the contact anchored her. Go to sleep, Nora, he murmured, his voice rumbling against her spine. For the first time since she arrived on the mountain, Nora closed her eyes and didn't dream of falling. March came and went with a brutal, weeping thaw. Ice turned to slush, then to mud, and finally the dark, rich soil of the mountain began to peek through the receding white. Carmine was back on his feet, though he favored his right leg. A heavy, uneven limp hitched his stride. He didn't complain about it. He just adapted, shifting his weight, learning a new way to move through the timber. Nora adapted right alongside him. She no longer trailed behind him on the trap lines. She walked beside him, her own steps sure and steady on the treacherous melting ground. They worked in tandem. A silent, seamless partnership had forged itself in the crucible of the cabin. When Carmine split wood, Nora stacked it. When Nora skinned the game, Carmine sharpened the knives. The hostility that had defined their early days was entirely gone, replaced by an awareness of each other that was almost suffocating in its intensity. Sleeping back to back had become a necessity that morphed into a habit. Nora knew the exact rhythm of his breathing before he fell asleep. Carmine knew that Nora always kicked her left foot out from under the heavy buffalo robe when she got too warm. They didn't talk about it. Talking would require defining it, and neither of them was brave enough to put a name to whatever this was. One afternoon late in April, the sound echoed through the valley. It was a sharp, concussive crack, like a cannon firing, followed by a sustained, echoing rumble. Nora dropped the bucket of water she was carrying from the spring. She spun around, looking for an avalanche, her heart hammering in her ribs. Carmine was standing on the porch, his hand white-knuckling the axe handle. He was staring down the valley toward the lower lake, his jaw locked tight. His face had drained of color. Nora understood instantly. The ice on the lake was breaking up. The spring thaw was violently tearing the frozen surface apart. She walked up onto the porch. She didn't say his name. She didn't ask if he was all right. She simply reached out and wrapped her calloused, blister-scarred hand over his massive, tense fist on the axe handle. Carmine flinched at the contact, his eyes snapping to hers. He looked wild for a second, trapped in a memory of freezing water and a slipping grip. "I'm here," Nora said, keeping her voice low, steady and entirely present. "I'm right here on solid ground." He stared at her. The wildness slowly bled out of his eyes, replaced by a profound, exhaustion-laced relief. He uncurled his fingers, letting the axe drop to the wooden floorboards with a heavy thud. He turned his hand over, tangling his thick fingers with hers. He didn't pull her into an embrace. He just held her hand, gripping it like a lifeline, as the echoes of the breaking ice faded into the trees. "Trail will be clear in a week," he said, his voice a rough gravel whisper. Nora felt a cold spike driven directly into her chest. The bargain. "You give me a roof and fire until the pass is open in April, and I'll leave on the first wagon down." She pulled her hand back slowly. The warmth of his grip lingered on her skin, mocking her. "I'll start packing my trunk." Carmine didn't stop her. He just picked up the axe, stepped off the porch and walked toward the woodpile, his limp more pronounced than it had been in days. 7 days later, the sound of grinding wooden wheels and shouting mules broke the morning silence. Nora was inside, scrubbing the cast-iron pan one last time. Her battered carpet bag and the heavy trunk sat by the door. She wore the same thin wool coat she had arrived in, though it hung differently on her now. Underneath it, her shoulders were broader, her arms corded with lean muscle. She wasn't the terrified, sickly girl who had begged for shelter. She was a woman who had fought a mountain and won. Carmine stood in the yard holding the mules by the harness as the driver hopped down from the buckboard. It was the same driver from November. He looked at Carmine, then at the cabin. "Pass is a mess, Steves, but we made it," the driver said, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice into the mud. "Got your flour, your salt, and your coffee. Here tell you survived the Widowmaker winter." "Barely," Carmine said. His eyes flicked to the cabin door. Nora stepped out. She picked up her carpet bag. She left the heavy trunk inside. She wouldn't need it. Whatever life she was walking into down in the valley, it wouldn't require the polite dresses she had packed in Chicago. The driver did a double-take. "Well, I'll be damned. You're still alive." "I am," Nora said flatly. She walked down the steps. The mud squelched beneath her boots. She walked straight to Carmine. He let go of the mules. He wouldn't look her in the eye. He was staring at a spot over her shoulder, his jaw set in a rigid, unforgiving line. He reached into his canvas coat, pulled out a small leather pouch, and held it out to her. "What's this?" Nora asked, not taking it. "Gold dust. Panned it last summer," he said. "It's enough to pay off your father's debt in Chicago, and buy a train ticket to anywhere else you want to go. New York, San Francisco, you earned it." Nora stared at the pouch. It was freedom. It was exactly what she had run into the freezing dark to find. She took the pouch. It was heavy. "Thank you," she said, her voice tight. "Driver will take you as far as the railhead in Cheyenne," Carmine said, finally dropping his gaze to meet hers. There was a wall behind his pale blue eyes, thick and impenetrable. He was shutting her out. He was choosing the ghost of his past over the living, breathing woman standing in front of him. Nora felt the anger flare, bright and hot. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to hit him. She wanted him to fight for her, just once the way she had fought for him when the fever had him by the throat. But she wouldn't beg. She had begged to stay. She wouldn't beg to be loved. "Take care of the leg, Carmine," she said quietly. "Don't swing the axe like a brute. Let the weight do the work." She turned around and walked to the wagon. The driver offered her a hand up. She ignored it, climbing onto the hard wooden bench on her own. "All right, Steves," the driver called out, climbing up beside her and taking the reins. "See you before the snow flies again." Carmine didn't answer. He just stood in the mud, a massive solitary figure against the backdrop of the pines. The driver cracked the whip. The mules lurched forward. The wagon wheels groaned, biting into the mud, pulling Nora away from the cabin, away from the mountain, away from the only place she had ever felt entirely safe. She stared straight ahead. She refused to cry. Crying was for the city. They made it 50 yards down the rutted trail. The cabin was about to disappear behind a stand of heavy spruce. "Wait!" A voice cracked through the thin mountain air. The driver pulled back on the reins, swearing under his breath. The mules huffed to a halt. Nora turned her head slowly. Carmine was walking down the muddy track. He wasn't limping. He was ignoring the pain, taking long, hard strides, eating up the distance between them. He reached the wagon, breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his coat. He grabbed the side of the buckboard, his knuckles white. He looked up at Nora. The wall in his eyes was gone. It had shattered, leaving nothing but raw, terrifying vulnerability. "You promised," Carmine said, his voice shaking. "You promised you wouldn't let go." Nora's breath hitched in her throat. "That was for the fever, Carmine." "No," he said fiercely, stepping closer to the wheel. "It wasn't. You dragged me out of the dark. You kept the fire burning. You can't just fix me and then leave me alone in that box. You told me to leave." Nora fired back her own voice, cracking. "You gave me gold to pay my debt." "I gave you a choice." Carmine corrected his tone, dropping, turning desperate. "Because I didn't want to trap you. You're not the woman I chose. I chose a farm girl because she was safe. I chose a business transaction." He reached up, wrapping his massive scarred hand over hers, where it rested on the wooden bench. "But you're the woman I want," he whispered. "I'm terrified of you, Nora Higgins. I'm terrified that if you fall, I won't be able to catch you. But I'm more terrified of watching this wagon roll down this mountain without you." Nora looked down at him. She saw the truth of it in the rigid set of his shoulders, in the desperate grip of his hand. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was standing on the ice, daring it to break, betting his life that she would hold on. She looked at the leather pouch of gold dust in her lap. She picked it up. She tossed it over her shoulder into the deep mud behind the wagon. The driver let out a squawk of pure outrage. "What in the hell are you doing, lady?" Nora ignored him. She slid off the hard wooden bench, stepping down from the wagon wheel directly into Carmine. He caught her, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. The impact knocked the breath out of both of them. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling the scent of lye soap wood smoke and cold air. Nora wrapped her arms around his broad shoulders, holding on with a grip that bruised. "I'm staying," she murmured against his coat. "But you're building a bigger bed." Carmine let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He pulled back, cupping her face with both hands, his thumbs tracing the sharp, cold curve of her cheekbones. He kissed her. It wasn't polite. It was a collision, rough, desperate, and deeply alive. It tasted like survival and salt, and a promise forged in the bitter cold. "Go on, then." Carmine barked at the driver, not taking his eyes off Nora. "Get down the mountain." The driver grumbled, shaking his head at the madness of mountain folk, and whipped the mules forward. The wagon rattled away, leaving them standing in the muddy rut. Nora looked up at the jagged peaks framing the sky. They were still harsh, still unforgiving. But as Carmine took her hand, and they turned to walk back toward the smoking chimney of the cabin, the mountain didn't look quite so cold anymore. That's the end of Nora and Carmine's brutal, beautiful fight for survival and each other. If this slow-burn Wild West romance